So you might have heard the term open source being thrown around in a bunch of different areas. Today we're going to talk about what open source actually is. We're also going to dive into what it looked like in the PC era, the mobile era, as well as the future and the AI era.
Yeah, open source refers to something that can be shared and modified because of its designed to be publicly accessible. It's normally talked about in terms of software development. Taking a closer look, open source starts as a repository. So repositories are normally hosted on GitHub, which is a development platform that allows users to create, modify, and store their code. It's based around Git, which is a version control software that actually, funny enough, started as an open source project itself.
So when open source projects actually start, there are a couple different players in the game. First, we have contributors, and contributors can actually be anybody, right? So these are the people that are going to be the ones copying the source code, and they can make the changes that they actually want to put in. Once they have this written code, they have the ability to fix bugs, add new features, or even just include documents for some of the existing code. They then go out and make a pull request to the owners.
At the next level, we have committers. So committers are the people that decide whether or not a change actually gets committed to the project. A committer can be anyone that has write access. So this is the founder of a repository or someone that has gained the trust of a founder repository.
Yeah, so once a project gets big enough, a foundation is created. And this usually comes with a simple naming convention like blank foundation, such as the Linux Foundation or the Eclipse Foundation.
These projects are governed with various different open source licenses. So the most common is GPL, which allows the code to be studied, modified, and shared. Others include MIT, Apache, and Proprietary.
So there are a ton of benefits of projects being open sourced. A major plus of this is transparency. Transparency is at the heart of open source. This transparency allows developers and users alike to examine the code and understand exactly how it actually works. This also ensures that it does what it's meant to do without any of those hidden functionalities.
Additionally, the collaborative potential of open source can't be overstated. So developers have various different backgrounds when working on these projects. So the innovation is not only rapid, but it also has a diverse amount of perspectives. This collaborative environment helps in overcoming the silo effect that is seen in a lot of proprietary development, making open source tools more innovative and adaptable to new challenges.
Another huge benefit of open source is the pace of it. You think about a project and you're now having all of these different people work on it. If this was a closed source project, there'd be a very limited amount of people that could actually work on it. So it's just the fact that it expedites the process and makes it much faster.
One common misconception with open source is that the software is less secure because of its public nature. In reality, the opposite is normally true. More eyes on the code mean that there's more chances to catch and fix any security flaws. However, open source is not without its challenges. So the collaborative nature of open source can sometimes lead to inconsistent coding standards and project direction, which poses a challenge for management and integration for the projects.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of sustainability. Open source often relies on a community of volunteers. So with anything in life, being dependent on other people can be a potential risk. So if the volunteers quit or become less interested or burnt out, the project is at risk of slowing down and even reducing in quality.
This actually leads us to question, what incentives do developers have to contribute to these open source projects? So the main motivator is going to be professional development. So they're able to hone in on their coding skills, learn new technologies, build somewhat of a tech portfolio. If they're working on well-known projects, they can build a new community of tech developers, which can open them up to new career opportunities. You always see developers flex their GitHub page with all their green on their calendar, showing that they always contribute to projects.
So beyond just the personal and professional gains, there's also this strong sense of community and ideology among open source contributors. Many believe in the credibility and goals of open source projects, and they contribute because they want to be a part of a movement that makes technology accessible and usable for everybody. And this is without restrictions imposed by these proprietary licenses.
Lastly, some of the contributors are motivated by a financial gain. So, though open source projects are free to use, they often have further application that requires some sort of financial investment from businesses. So, either, support or customization for their particular business. Contributors can also leverage their expertise in a consulting service or even secure funding to work through sponsorship from companies that are also benefiting from that technology. This is definitely an issue that we see, though, is a lot of these big tech companies are using these open source projects to a large extent and are not rewarding contributors properly.
So now here's where we're going to talk about some of the different eras that open source has gone through. Like we said, there's the PC era, the mobile era, and then the AI era.
So as far as the PC era goes, we can safely say that open source won. This is mainly due to Linux, actually, which was an open source project. We talked about it briefly earlier in the video, but it became a cornerstone for server environments and for corporate data centers because, it was cheap, it's free, and it's reliable, and it had so much customization available. We also had a lot of open source tools for programming. So Python is an open source language that has been used everywhere, but we also have like PHP and Java. Alongside these programming languages, a lot of developing environments were also made open source, like the Eclipse Foundation that we talked earlier. The community was also very strong for open source ideology throughout the PC era. We had Apache HTTP server and MySQL database that were developed open source. And so this meant a lot of the applications that were built in the PC era were just as much developer focused as they were consumer focused, which differs from what we'll talk about with the mobile era.
And so after the PC era came the mobile era, and this is really when iOS and Android, who are controlled by Apple and Google respectively, took over. Yeah, so even though Android is Linux kernel and therefore open source, the ecosystem and mainly the app stores were heavily controlled by Google and therefore closed. The business models were controlled all through these app stores and development was very heavily regulated. Yeah, and so just like Conall said, the apps that were built in the PC era were equally developer focused as well as consumer focused, whereas the mobile apps were almost entirely consumer focused. This closed nature has led to much less rapid innovation and creativity.
And this brings us to the AI era, which we're currently in the midst of. Neither open source or closed source has won this era yet, but we have companies like Meta that are pushing open source, with Mark Zuckerberg and Jan LeCun pushing it heavily. We also have Mistral, which is pushing open source really hard. And of course, Elon Musk has been pushing open source AI development since the foundation of OpenAI. We also have some people like Ilya Sutskever that don't necessarily think everything should be open sourced.
So like most topics, we don't know the exact direction that the AI era is going to end in. It could be open source or it also could be closed source.
And we talked about the pros of open source, but we also talked about some cons. So it's really up to the leaders of the industry to decide which it's going to be. And I think to a large extent, it stems from just regular people like us and, you guys watching, talking about this type of stuff to decide whether it's going to be open or closed sourced.
All right, well, thank you guys for joining us once again. We very much appreciate you guys being here, and talk to us about open versus closed source in the comments.
Yeah, so we have a question for you guys. So what is onces plus onces?
It's going to be
deuces.